The alarm on my ship screamed before I even opened my eyes, and I knew, in that first half-second of waking, that something on this contract had already gone wrong. My name is Kalen Thor, and I have spent 43 cycles of my life as a mercenary. I have fought on frozen moons where the air itself could freeze your blood, and on burning deserts where the ground melted boots. I have led squads of the finest soldiers our galaxy has ever produced, soldiers from 100 worlds, each one hardened by war, each one paid well to make war happen for someone else. I am Oseron, born on a world where combat is not just a profession, it is a culture, a religion, a way of proving that you are worth the air you breathe. We do not fear death, we fear only failure. But nothing in 43 cycles of fighting prepared me for what I found on a small, forgotten mining colony called Varen Hollow, orbiting a dull yellow star that most star charts do not even bother to name. It started as the easiest contract of my career. I remember sitting in the briefing hall of my ship, the Ashwind Talon, with my second-in-command, a broad-shouldered Oseron named Breck Solon, and 6 other soldiers who had fought beside me for cycles. Our employer was a trading conglomerate called the Voss Trade Combine, a company that controlled mining rights across a dozen systems. They had a problem. A small human settlement on Varen Hollow had stopped paying tribute for the ore they extracted. And worse, they had started defending their shipments instead of surrendering them quietly, the way every other client species did. Humans. I remember laughing when I heard the word. At that point in my life, I had heard of humans only in passing. They were a young species, barely a few centuries into space travel, still fumbling their way across the stars, like children learning to walk. The stories that reached us were mostly jokes, told over drinks in mercenary lounges across a dozen systems. Humans were said to be short-lived, physically weak compared to most species we fought, and hopelessly sentimental. They were known for building strange little communities everywhere they went, planting gardens on dead rocks, naming their ships after old poems. Nobody took them seriously as a military threat. Nobody had any reason to. Breck laughed the loudest of all of us. He had fought Karathi war clans and Yellow Talon raiders, and even a squad of Draveth shock troops on a contract 2 cycles earlier, an engagement that had cost us 3 good soldiers. He looked at the human colony's file, at the population numbers, at the pathetic list of weapons registered to their small militia, and he shook his head. "This will be a vacation," he said. "We will be home before the drinks go warm." I should have listened more carefully to the silence that followed his joke. Nobody else laughed with him, not because they disagreed, but because a good soldier learns, eventually, to feel a job in his gut before he understands it in his head. And something about that silence, something about the flat, careful way our client had described the situation, sat wrong with me even then. Our orders were simple enough: land near the colony, secure the mining operations, remove any armed resistance, and restore the flow of tribute to the Voss Trade Combine. We were told there might be a handful of colonial defenders, described as an untrained militia armed with outdated rifles. We were told to expect no real fight. I gathered my squad in the briefing hall one final time before we entered the system. 8 of us in total, myself and Breck included. Standing beside us were Torvak, a demolition specialist who had survived 4 separate contracts that should have killed him. Issa, our sniper, calm and precise, a soldier who never wasted a single shot in the cycles I had known her. Dren and Callow, brothers by blood and by war, inseparable since the day they enlisted. Marrow, our medic, gentle in conversation but brutal in a fight when the moment called for it. And finally Vex, our youngest soldier, barely past his warrior trials, eager to prove himself on what everyone assumed would be an easy contract. I looked at each of them and felt something I had not expected to feel before such a simple mission. Pride, yes, as always, but also, quietly, a flicker of unease I could not explain. We entered orbit above Varen Hollow 2 days later. The colony itself looked exactly as unimpressive as the reports had promised. A scattering of low metal structures built into the side of a rocky valley, surrounded by mining equipment that looked older than some of my soldiers. Dust storms rolled across the surface in slow, lazy waves. There were no visible defense platforms, no orbital weapons, nothing that suggested any serious military presence. And yet, as our shuttle broke atmosphere, our communications officer picked up something strange. A single, short burst of encrypted human chatter, gone before our systems could decode it. Just a fragment of a voice, calm, controlled, speaking words we could not understand. I remember Torvak leaning toward the comm panel, frowning. "That does not sound like a mining colony's emergency channel," he said. I told him it was probably nothing. Old equipment. Interference. I told myself the same thing more than once as our shuttle descended toward the valley floor. But the closer we came to landing, the more that small flicker of unease inside me grew into something heavier, something that sat in my chest like a stone I could not swallow. I looked out the viewport at the quiet, dusty valley below us, and for the first time since I could remember, a small part of me hoped that this contract really would be as easy as everyone assumed. I did not yet know how wrong that hope would turn out to be. The shuttle touched down in a shallow basin half a kilometer from the main colony structures, exactly where our maps told us to expect an open approach with clear lines of sight. Dust kicked up around the landing struts in slow, heavy clouds, and for a long moment, nobody moved. We simply sat there, listening to the wind outside, waiting for some sign of resistance that never came. Breck broke the silence first, laughing under his breath as he checked his weapon one final time. "See," he said, "a vacation." I forced a smile and said nothing. My eyes stayed fixed on the valley ahead, on the quiet metal shapes of the colony buildings in the distance, half hidden behind curtains of drifting dust. Something about the stillness of that place did not sit right with me. It was too quiet, too calm. Even the wind seemed to move with a kind of patience I had never noticed in weather before. We disembarked in formation, weapons ready, moving in the careful, practiced rhythm that 8 cycles of fighting together had carved into our bodies. Issa took the high ground on a nearby ridge, scanning the colony through her scope. Dren and Callow moved ahead as our forward scouts, while Torvak and Marrow held the rear, and Vex stayed close to me, watching everything with wide, eager eyes. The first few minutes passed exactly as expected. We crossed open ground without incident, our sensors picking up no active weapons, no organized defensive positions, nothing but empty mining equipment and a handful of small residential structures scattered across the valley floor. Then Issa's voice came through our comms, quiet and controlled. "Movement," she said. 200 meters northeast. One figure, unarmed it looks like. I raised a hand, signaling the squad to hold position, and looked toward the ridgeline she had indicated. A single figure stood there, silhouetted against the pale morning sky, watching us without moving. Even from that distance, something about the stillness of that figure unsettled me. It did not run, it did not raise an alarm, it simply stood there, observing, as if it already knew exactly why we had come. I ordered Dren and Callow to approach carefully and identify the figure. They moved forward in practiced formation, weapons lowered but ready, calling out in the shared trade language most of the galaxy had learned to use for exactly this kind of encounter. The figure did not respond in words. Instead, it simply turned and walked calmly back over the ridge, disappearing from sight before my soldiers could close the distance. That was the first moment I felt real doubt creep into my mind. I called Issa down from her position, gathered the squad together in a tight formation, and reviewed our approach. Something about that encounter did not match anything in our briefing. Untrained militia did not stand calmly in the open, studying an armed mercenary squad, and then simply walk away without panic or challenge. That kind of composure took training, discipline, the kind of discipline our reports had assured us this colony did not possess. Breck noticed my hesitation and placed a hand on my shoulder, the same gesture he had used before every difficult contract we had shared over the cycles. "Whatever it is," he said, "we have faced worse. We are Osseran. We do not run from shadows." I nodded, though the unease in my chest had not faded. We continued our advance toward the colony, moving now with slightly more caution than before, weapons raised, eyes scanning every shadow between the mining structures ahead. It was Vex who spotted the first sign of real trouble. He called out from our left flank, his voice tight with confusion rather than fear. I turned to see him crouched beside a low metal structure, staring at something on the ground. When I reached him, I understood immediately why his voice had changed. Someone had been here recently. Fresh markings in the dust, careful and deliberate, formed a pattern I did not recognize at first. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. It was a map, drawn quickly but precisely into the dirt, showing the layout of the valley, our expected landing zone, and several routes leading away from the colony into the surrounding hills. Someone had known exactly where we would land, long before we arrived. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that simple drawing in the dust, feeling the last of my earlier confidence drain away. Whoever we were dealing with, they were not the disorganized, panicked militia described in our reports. They were patient, observant, and they had been preparing for our arrival with a level of discipline I had never encountered in any client species before. Breck knelt beside me, studying the markings with a frown that mirrored my own growing concern. "This does not look like a militia drawing," he said quietly. "This looks like a plan." Before I could respond, Yisa's voice cut through our comms again, sharper this time, edged with an urgency I had rarely heard from her in all our cycles together. "Movement," she said. "Multiple positions. They are not running from us." I looked up toward the colony structures ahead, and for the first time since landing on Varen Hollow, I felt the true weight of what we had walked into settle over me like a shadow blotting out the sun. Somewhere among those quiet metal buildings, patient eyes were watching our every move, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal themselves. Whatever these humans were, they were nothing like the stories I had laughed about back on my ship. And as I raised my weapon and signaled my squad forward into that waiting silence, I felt, for the first time in 43 cycles of war, a cold and unfamiliar feeling settle into my chest. I felt afraid. The silence that followed Issa's warning lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds stretched inside my mind like hours. I remember the exact texture of the dust under my boots, the exact angle of the pale sun overhead, the exact sound of my own breathing, slow and controlled, the way 43 cycles of training had taught me to breathe before violence found me. Then the first shot came, and everything I thought I understood about this contract shattered at once. It did not come from the ridge where the lone figure had stood earlier. It came from somewhere behind us, low and precise, striking Torvak in the shoulder before any of us had even registered the sound of the weapon firing. He dropped instantly, more from surprise than injury, cursing in our native tongue as Marrow rushed to his side. I turned, weapon raised, scanning the mining structures behind us for any sign of the shooter. There was nothing, no muzzle flash, no movement, no sound but the wind and Torvak's ragged breathing as Marrow worked quickly to stabilize him. "Cover!" I shouted, and my squad scattered into the nearest defensible positions, pressing against the metal walls of an old storage structure that offered at least some protection from whatever direction the next attack would come from. Callow was the next to go down. I did not even hear the shot that struck him. One moment he was moving beside his brother toward a low wall for cover, and the next he was on the ground, clutching his leg, his face twisted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. Dren was at his side instantly, dragging him behind cover while returning fire toward a ridgeline that, as far as any of us could tell, held absolutely nothing. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it is the part of that day I still think about more than anything else. In 43 cycles of war, I had fought enemies who screamed challenges before battle. I had fought enemies who fired wildly in panic, wasting ammunition in desperate hope of scoring a lucky hit. I had fought enemies who broke formation and ran the moment they took real losses. What we faced on Varen Hollow did none of these things. There was no shouting, no panic, no wasted shots. Every attack came fast, precise, and then vanished completely, as if the people firing at us existed only for the half-second it took to pull a trigger before dissolving back into the landscape. We had no clear targets to return fire against. We had no clear direction from which to expect the next attack. All we had was the growing, horrifying realization that whoever was fighting us understood this terrain far better than we ever could, and was using that understanding with a discipline that made every one of our advantages meaningless. Breck crouched beside me, breathing hard, his eyes scanning the ridgelines with the same desperate focus I felt in my own chest. "This is not a militia," he said, his voice low and tight. "Militias do not fight like this." I did not answer him immediately. My mind was too busy trying to process the tactical reality unfolding around us. Whoever we were facing had not simply prepared a defense. They had studied us. They had anticipated our landing zone, our formation, our likely reactions, and they were now executing a plan built specifically to exploit every weakness in how we operated. I gave the order to fall back toward higher ground, hoping to gain better visibility and force whoever was attacking us into the open. It was, I admit now, the correct tactical decision given the information we had. It was also, in hindsight, exactly what our unseen opponents wanted us to do. The moment we broke from our initial position and began moving toward the higher ground to our east, the attacks intensified, not in volume, but in precision. Every soldier who exposed themselves for even a fraction of a second found themselves targeted almost instantly, as though our attackers had already calculated exactly where we would move before we moved there ourselves. Vex was the next to fall. I remember turning at the sound of his voice, sharp and sudden, cut off almost as quickly as it began. He had been moving to cover Vex's flank, following the exact formation we had used successfully in a dozen contracts before this one. It made no difference here. He went down hard, and though Marrow reached him within seconds, the young soldier who had been so eager to prove himself just hours earlier now lay silent and still on the dusty ground of a colony none of us had ever heard of before this contract began. I felt something shift inside me in that moment, something I had never experienced before in all my cycles of war. It was not simply fear of losing the fight. It was the deeper, colder fear of facing an intelligence that understood war in a way I did not yet comprehend. We managed to reach higher ground eventually, though at a cost I had not expected to pay so early into this contract. From our new position, we finally caught our first true glimpse of the force we were fighting. There were perhaps a dozen of them, moving in small, disciplined groups across the valley floor below us. They wore simple, practical gear, nothing like the heavy armor or elaborate weapons systems I had expected from a serious military threat. And yet, every movement they made carried a quiet, deliberate efficiency that reminded me more of a well-rehearsed performance than a battle. I studied them through my scope, searching for any sign of the disorganized panic our briefing had promised us. I found none. Instead, I found calm, coordinated movement between cover positions, weapons handled with an ease that spoke of extensive training, and a complete absence of the chaotic energy I associated with untrained fighters facing a superior force. One of them paused briefly in the open, looking directly toward our position on the ridge, and for a long moment our eyes met across that impossible distance. I could not read the expression on the face I saw, human features being unfamiliar enough to me at the time that I struggled to interpret them properly. But something in that brief, steady gaze told me clearly that this person was not afraid of us, not even slightly. Breck noticed it too, and for the first time since I had known him, I heard genuine uncertainty in his voice. "They are not fighting like an army protecting a colony," he said quietly. "They are fighting like they have done this 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different places." I did not have an answer for him. All I had was the growing certainty that whatever we had walked into on Varen Hollow, it was nothing close to the simple, easy contract we had been promised. We held our position on the ridge for what felt like an eternity, though my internal chronometer later confirmed it had been less than 20 minutes. In that time, we lost no more soldiers, but neither did we manage to identify a single clear target worth engaging. Every attempt to advance was met with the same precise, unhurried resistance, as though our opponents had unlimited patience and no need to rush toward any conclusion. It was during this standoff that I first noticed something that would haunt me for cycles afterward. At no point during the fighting had any of our attackers fired a shot that could be considered lethal without clear justification. Torvak's wound, though painful, had been placed with surgical precision to disable rather than kill. Kalo's injury followed the same pattern. Even Vex, who had suffered the most serious wound among us, was alive, stabilized by Marrow's quick work, but very deliberately left alive by whoever had fired that shot. I mentioned this observation to Breck as we regrouped, and I watched the color drain slightly from his face as the implications settled over him. "They are choosing not to kill us," he said slowly. "They could have. They are choosing not to." That realization sat heavier on me than any of the injuries we had sustained. In 43 cycles of mercenary work, I had never once encountered an enemy force capable of exercising that level of restraint under fire, let alone one willing to do so against an armed and hostile squad actively trying to remove them from their own homes. We eventually made the decision to withdraw and regroup at a safer distance, gathering our wounded and retreating toward a defensible position near a dry riverbed a kilometer from the colony structures. As we moved, I found myself glancing repeatedly over my shoulder, half expecting to see our attackers pursuing us in a final decisive strike. They never came. Instead, as we reached the relative safety of the riverbed, our comms picked up a single, brief transmission, spoken clearly in our own trade language rather than the fragmented human speech we had intercepted earlier. "Go home," the voice said, calm and unhurried. "This is your only warning." Then the transmission ended, and the valley fell silent once more, leaving my squad and I to sit in stunned, exhausted disbelief at everything we had just witnessed. I looked around at what remained of my team. Torvak, pale but stable, leaning against a rock while Marrow finished dressing his wound. Dren, sitting close beside his injured brother, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet, watchful tension I had never seen in him before. Issa, still scanning the ridgelines through her scope, searching for a threat that seemed to have simply decided to let us go. And Breck, standing beside me, staring out toward the colony with an expression I had never once seen on his face in all our cycles together. For the first time in his long and violent career, my oldest friend and most trusted soldier looked genuinely shaken. "We are going to need reinforcements," he said quietly, "or we are going to need to leave this world and never come back." I did not answer him immediately. I simply stood there, looking out at the quiet valley below, trying to reconcile the calm, disciplined force we had just encountered with everything I thought I understood about the young, supposedly weak species called humanity. Somewhere in that valley, patient and unafraid, an enemy waited who understood war on a level I was only beginning to grasp, and though I did not yet know it, the true depth of that lesson had barely begun to reveal itself to me. We spent the next 2 days in a strange, uneasy stillness that felt more unsettling than the fighting itself had been. I ordered the squad to fall back to the Ashwind Talon and treat our wounded properly, using the ship's medical bay rather than field supplies that Marrow had already stretched to their limit. Torvak recovered quickly, his shoulder wound clean and already healing well under proper care. Kalo would need longer, his leg requiring careful attention before he could return to full duty. Vex remained the most serious concern, stable but weak, sleeping through most of those first 2 days as his body worked to recover from the damage it had taken. I used that time to review every scrap of information we had gathered, searching for some explanation that made sense of what we had faced on Varen Hollow. I studied the recordings from our helmet cameras, watching again and again as small groups of humans moved through the valley with a discipline that seemed to grow more impressive with each viewing rather than less. I listened to the single recorded transmission over and over, studying the calm, unhurried tone of that warning, searching for some crack in the composure it represented. I found nothing. If anything, I found more questions than answers. Breck spent much of that time beside me, equally consumed by the same unsettling puzzle. It was during one of those long, quiet sessions in the ship's command room that he raised a possibility neither of us had considered before. "What if this is not a colony militia at all?" he said, staring at a frozen frame of one of the human fighters mid-movement across the valley. What if we accidentally stumbled into something else entirely? I asked him what he meant, and he gestured toward the screen, toward the precise, economical way the figure moved between cover positions. "Look at how they carry themselves," he said. "Look at how they communicate without speaking. Look at how patient they are, even when they clearly could have ended this fight faster than they did. This is not the behavior of frightened miners defending their homes for the first time. This is the behavior of people who have done this before, many times, in many places, against many different enemies." I did not want to believe him, but the more I studied the recordings, the harder it became to argue against his theory. Whoever we had encountered on Varen Hollow, they were not simple colonists forced into an unfamiliar role. They were something far more dangerous, hiding in plain sight beneath the guise of an ordinary mining settlement. Our employer, when we contacted them for clarification, offered little comfort. The representative from the Voss Trade Combine, a nervous, evasive man named Callum Ashworth, insisted repeatedly that their records showed nothing unusual about the Varen Hollow settlement. According to their files, it was a standard mining colony, established several cycles earlier, populated by ordinary human workers with no known military affiliation. I asked him directly whether any part of that colony's population might have connections to human military forces, and I remember the long, uncomfortable pause that followed my question before he answered. "Our records show no such connections," he said finally, his voice carrying a tension that told me clearly he was either lying or simply did not know the truth himself. "Complete the contract as agreed, and your payment will be processed as usual." I ended that conversation more troubled than before it began. We returned to Varen Hollow 3 days later, this time with reinforcements requested directly from the Voss Trade Combine. 12 additional soldiers joined our depleted squad, mercenaries from several different species with reputations nearly as fearsome as our own. Among them was a Dravith heavy weapons specialist named Krosh, whose reputation for overwhelming firepower had ended more than one conflict before it truly began, and a pair of yellow talon scouts known for tracking targets across terrain most species considered impossible to navigate. I remember Krosh laughing when he heard our account of the previous engagement, dismissing our concerns with the same casual confidence Breck had shown before our first landing. "You let a handful of unarmed farmers push you back," he said, shaking his head. "This time, we finish it properly." I did not argue with him. Some lessons I had already learned could only be taught through direct experience rather than warning. Our second approach to the colony was far more cautious than the first, informed by everything we had learned during our initial encounter. We split into smaller teams, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm whatever defensive strategy our opponents had used against us previously. It made no difference at all. The moment we crossed the perimeter of the valley, the same precise, unhurried resistance began, striking each of our approaching teams with an efficiency that seemed to account for our new numbers without any visible increase in effort. Krosh's overwhelming firepower proved useless against an enemy who simply refused to remain in any position long enough to be targeted by his weapons. The Yellow Talon scouts, so confident in their tracking abilities, found themselves completely unable to locate the source of the attacks striking their own formation. I watched from a secondary position as Krosh's team was systematically disabled within minutes, each soldier struck with the same careful precision we had witnessed during our first encounter. No fatal wounds, no unnecessary suffering, just quick, efficient removal of each threat, one soldier at a time, until Krosh himself stood alone, firing wildly into empty terrain, before finally falling silent, struck by a shot that ended his part in the battle, without ending his life. The Yellow Talon scouts fared no better, disappearing from our comms one by one as they attempted to track an enemy who somehow always remained several steps ahead of their pursuit. I gave the order to fall back before we lost anyone else, and as my remaining squad retreated once more toward the safety of our transport, I found myself studying the valley with a growing, uncomfortable respect I had never expected to feel toward an opposing force. It was during this second retreat that the most significant moment of the entire contract occurred, one that would change how I understood this conflict forever. Dren, still grieving his brother's earlier injury and desperate to prove something to himself after our humiliating withdrawal, broke formation during our retreat, moving alone toward a cluster of colony structures in a reckless attempt to locate and confront whoever had been responsible for Callow's wound. I called out for him to return immediately, but he either did not hear me or chose not to listen. He disappeared from view within seconds, swallowed by the maze of metal structures ahead. We lost contact with him entirely for the better part of 3 hours, during which time my remaining squad held position at a defensible distance, unwilling to risk another advance into the valley, but equally unwilling to abandon one of our own. I remember those 3 hours as some of the longest of my entire career, filled with a helpless uncertainty that no amount of combat experience had prepared me to handle. When Dren finally returned to us, he arrived not through his own effort, but escorted quietly to the edge of our position by 2 human fighters who released him without a single word before withdrawing calmly back into the valley. He was unharmed, though visibly shaken in a way I had never seen from him before. It took him nearly an hour to compose himself enough to explain what had happened during those missing hours, and what he described left the entire squad in stunned, uneasy silence. According to Dren, he had been captured almost immediately after entering the colony structures, subdued quickly, and without any unnecessary harm, by a small group of human fighters who seemed to have been expecting his approach. Rather than harming him further or using him as leverage against the rest of us, they had simply held him in a quiet, secure location, tending to a minor injury he had sustained during his capture and offering him water and basic care while they waited. He described one soldier in particular, a woman named Nora Ellison, who had spoken with him calmly throughout his captivity, asking careful, measured questions about our employer and our mission, while offering almost nothing about her own side of the conflict in return. "She told me they did not want this fight," Dren said quietly, still visibly shaken by the memory. "She told me they had tried peaceful resolution with the Voss Trade Combine multiple times before we ever arrived, and every attempt had been ignored or dismissed. She said they were prepared to keep fighting for as long as necessary, but that they took no satisfaction in it." I asked him if she had said anything else, and he hesitated for a long moment before answering. "She said something I have not been able to stop thinking about since," he said. "She said that her people had learned long ago that the wars worth fighting were never the ones you enjoyed. She said the moment a soldier begins enjoying the violence is the same moment that soldier stops being useful for anything except more violence." I sat with that statement for a long time after Dren finished speaking, turning it over in my mind alongside everything else we had witnessed on Varen Hollow. Every assumption I had carried into this contract, every joke I had laughed at back on my ship, every dismissive comment about humanity's weakness and inexperience, now felt hollow and foolish in light of what we had actually encountered. We were not fighting an untrained militia desperately defending their homes. We were fighting something that understood war on a level that made our own considerable experience feel almost childish by comparison. An enemy who fought with total discipline, showed genuine restraint even in active combat, and somehow still maintained the moral clarity to question the value of violence even while engaging in it themselves. Breck voiced the question that had been quietly forming in all of our minds since Dren's return. "What exactly are these people?" he asked, his voice quiet in the aftermath of that long, difficult day. None of us had an answer. All we had was the growing, unavoidable certainty that whatever force we had stumbled into on this small, forgotten mining colony, it was something far beyond the simple contract we had originally agreed to fulfill. That night, as our depleted and thoroughly humbled squad prepared for whatever came next, I found myself standing alone at the edge of our camp, looking out toward the distant lights of the human colony glowing softly against the darkening sky. For the first time in 43 cycles of war, I felt something I had never truly experienced before in any previous conflict. I felt respect for an enemy I did not yet understand, and I felt a deep, growing dread about what might happen when our employer, frustrated by 2 failed attempts, finally decided to commit everything they had toward ending this conflict once and for all. I did not know it yet, standing there in the quiet darkness, but the true and final confrontation still waited ahead of us, and it would teach every mercenary present a lesson about humanity that none of us would ever be able to forget. The message from the Voss Trade Combine arrived 4 days later, and the moment I read it, I understood that everything we had experienced so far was about to become far more serious. Callum Ashworth's tone had changed completely from our previous conversation. Where he had once sounded evasive and uncertain, he now spoke with the cold, impatient authority of someone who had grown tired of excuses. The Combine, he informed us, had lost patience with the ongoing situation at Varen Hollow. 2 failed engagements, significant financial losses, and a growing reputation risk among their other client colonies had convinced their leadership to commit whatever resources were necessary to end this conflict permanently. They were sending a full battle group. I remember the exact moment I read the number of soldiers being deployed, more than 200 fighters drawn from several different mercenary companies, backed by orbital support and heavy armored vehicles capable of leveling entire structures within seconds. It was an overwhelming force, the kind typically reserved for suppressing organized planetary rebellions rather than a single small mining colony. Breck read the same message over my shoulder, and I heard him exhale slowly beside me. "This is no longer about tribute payments," he said quietly. "This is about the Combine refusing to admit they underestimated their enemy." I could not disagree with him. Everything about this escalation felt driven less by practical necessity and more by wounded pride, a powerful and often dangerous motivation among those who controlled contracts like ours. Our remaining squad was folded into this larger force as it arrived in orbit above Varen Hollow 3 days later. I stood on the deck of the lead assault ship, watching through the viewport as an overwhelming collection of military vessels gathered above the small, quiet world below us. It was, without question, more firepower than I had ever seen assembled against a single settlement in my entire career. And yet, standing there amid all that overwhelming strength, I felt no confidence at all, only a deep, growing unease that none of the other soldiers around me seemed to share. I tried, before the assault began, to share what my squad had learned during our previous 2 encounters with the officers now commanding this larger operation. I explained the discipline we had witnessed, the precise and unhurried nature of the resistance, the deliberate restraint shown even during active combat. I explained Dren's account of his brief captivity and the strange, unsettling composure of the woman who had spoken with him. Most of the officers listening to my report reacted with the same dismissive confidence Krosh had shown before our second failed attempt. A Dravith commander named Osric Van, leading the overall operation, waved away my concerns with barely concealed impatience. "Whatever discipline a handful of colonists managed to display against 8 soldiers means nothing against this force," he said. "We could level that entire valley from orbit if we wished. We are choosing restraint only because the Combine wants the mining equipment left intact." I did not argue further. Some warnings, I had already learned, meant nothing to those who had not yet experienced the reality behind them directly. The assault began at dawn, ground forces moving in overwhelming numbers across the valley floor, while armored vehicles advanced along the main approach routes, and orbital support remained on standby overhead. I watched from a secondary position alongside my remaining squad, ordered to hold in reserve given our previous losses, and for the first several minutes, it appeared that sheer numbers might finally accomplish what precision and patience had failed to achieve in our earlier attempts. Then, gradually, subtly at first, the pattern began to repeat itself. Soldiers advancing in the lead formations began falling in small, isolated numbers, struck by precise shots from positions that remained impossible to identify despite the overwhelming force now searching for them. Armored vehicles, protected by heavy plating designed to withstand direct assaults, found themselves disabled by carefully placed strikes against exposed mechanical components rather than destroyed outright, as though whoever was fighting us understood exactly which vulnerabilities to exploit without wasting effort on unnecessary destruction. I watched Commander Van's confident expression slowly shift into something far more uncertain as the reports continued streaming in from across the battlefield. Losses that should have been meaningless against a force our size began accumulating in ways that made no logical sense given the numbers involved. By midday, nearly a third of the assault force had been disabled through injuries rather than fatalities. Each wound placed with the same surgical precision my own squad had experienced during our earlier encounters. Vehicles sat motionless across the valley, their crews unharmed but unable to continue operating machines that had been disabled through careful, deliberate sabotage rather than destructive force. And still, we had not identified more than a handful of the actual fighters responsible for this devastating resistance. I remember standing beside Breck as the battle continued to unfold before us, watching a force nearly 30 times larger than the one we had originally brought struggle against an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. "They are not trying to win through numbers," Breck said quietly, echoing thoughts I had already begun forming myself. "They are trying to make us understand something." It was during the afternoon hours of that long, costly engagement that I witnessed something that would remain burned into my memory for the rest of my life. Commander Van, frustrated beyond reason by the mounting losses and the complete inability of his overwhelming force to locate a clear enemy to engage directly, ordered a full frontal assault against the main colony structures, disregarding every lesson our previous encounters should have taught him. Soldiers from a dozen different mercenary companies surged forward together, weapons blazing, moving with the kind of reckless aggression born from desperation rather than discipline. I watched through a scope as that overwhelming charge met an enemy who simply refused to fight on the terms being forced upon them. Rather than meeting that aggressive advance directly, the human defenders seemed to simply fade away from the areas under heaviest assault, allowing the charging soldiers to advance into empty structures and abandoned positions, while carefully placed strikes continued picking off isolated targets from angles nobody could predict or prepare for. It was less a battle in the traditional sense and more a slow, patient demonstration of exactly how meaningless overwhelming force became against an opponent who refused to fight according to expectations. By the time Commander Van finally called for a full withdrawal, nearly half of the massive force sent to end this conflict once and for all had been disabled through injury, their weapons and equipment rendered useless through careful sabotage, without a single confirmed fatality on either side of the engagement. I stood among the survivors gathering back at our landing zone that evening, surrounded by soldiers from a dozen different species, all of them carrying the same stunned, hollow expression I had seen on my own squad after our first failed encounter weeks earlier. Warriors who had faced down some of the most dangerous threats known across 100 systems now sat in silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. It was Breck who finally gave voice to the thought that had been slowly forming in my own mind throughout that long, humbling day. "We were never fighting a colony militia," he said quietly, staring out toward the darkened valley where our overwhelming force had just suffered its most complete defeat. "We were fighting people who have already learned every lesson about war that we still believe we need to teach them." I did not respond immediately. I simply sat there, watching the quiet lights of the human colony glowing steadily in the distance, completely unaffected by the massive force that had just spent an entire day failing to break their resistance. Commander Van attempted one final desperate measure before formally admitting defeat, ordering a limited orbital strike against the colony's outer perimeter in hopes of forcing a surrender through demonstration of force we had not yet used. I remember watching that strike unfold from a safe distance, expecting some visible sign of panic or capitulation from the colony below. Instead, our sensors picked up something we had not anticipated at all. A brief, calm transmission, broadcast openly rather than encrypted this time, spoken in a voice I recognized instantly from Dren's earlier description. "This is Nora Ellison," the voice said, steady and unhurried despite the recent strike. "We have allowed this conflict to continue longer than necessary because we hoped your employer might eventually choose diplomacy over violence. But that hope has clearly expired. Any further orbital action will be met with a response your commanders have not yet considered, and one your employer will find considerably more difficult to explain to their shareholders than a failed ground assault." The transmission ended there, offering no further explanation, no threats, no demands beyond the simple, quiet warning that had characterized every human communication throughout this entire contract. Commander Van did not order another strike. We withdrew fully from Varen Hollow that same night, our overwhelming force reduced to a battered, humbled collection of soldiers who had learned, at tremendous cost, exactly why every previous engagement with this colony had ended in failure. The Voss Trade Combine, faced with mounting losses and no clear path toward victory, quietly abandoned their pursuit of tribute from Varen Hollow within the following month, choosing instead to simply write off the entire mining operation rather than risk further confrontation. I never returned to that valley again after that final withdrawal, though I have thought about it often in the cycles since. I think about Nora Ellison's calm, steady voice. I think about the discipline and restraint shown by every human fighter we encountered, even in the heat of active combat. I think about Dren's account of his brief captivity, and the strange, unsettling composure of an enemy who somehow maintained moral clarity, even while engaged in violence, forced upon them by our own employer's greed. Most of all, I think about the lesson that entire contract taught me, one that would follow me for the rest of my career and eventually shape how every mercenary company across known space approached any contract involving human forces. We had arrived at Varen Hollow expecting an easy fight against a weak, inexperienced enemy. We left, having learned, at tremendous personal and professional cost, that humanity was not weak at all. They were simply patient, disciplined, and far more dangerous than any of us had been prepared to understand. And that lesson, once learned, could never be unlearned again. Cycles have passed since that contract on Varen Hollow, and I have long since retired from active mercenary work, though the story of that engagement has never truly left me. What surprised me most, in the years that followed, was discovering that our experience there was not an isolated event at all. It was simply the first thread in a much larger pattern that would eventually reshape how every serious mercenary company across known space approached any contract involving humanity. I learned this slowly, piece by piece, through conversations in mercenary lounges across a dozen systems, through quiet exchanges with old colleagues who had fought on contracts I never heard about until years later, through careful research I conducted myself once curiosity finally overcame my desire to simply forget what had happened on that small, forgotten mining world. The first story I encountered came from an old acquaintance named Finn Draska, a demolitions expert who had once fought alongside me on a contract involving Karathi war clans, cycles before Varen Hollow ever entered my life. We met by chance at a trading station on the Outer Rim, and over drinks, our conversation eventually turned toward the strangest contracts either of us had experienced during our long careers. When I described what had happened on Varen Hollow, expecting the usual disbelief or dismissal I had grown accustomed to receiving whenever I shared that story, Finn instead grew quiet, his expression shifting into something far more serious than I expected. "That sounds exactly like what happened to my company on a contract 3 cycles ago," he said slowly. "A supposedly simple security operation on a human trading outpost that turned into the worst engagement of my entire career." He described an experience remarkably similar to my own, a contract that appeared straightforward on paper, involving a small human settlement that had refused to comply with demands from a powerful client. An initial assessment describing the settlement's defenders as inexperienced and poorly equipped, and then, once the actual engagement began, a complete unraveling of every expectation his company had carried into that contract. He described the same eerie silence between engagements, the same complete absence of panic or disorganized retreat, the same unsettling precision in every strike, wounds placed carefully to disable rather than kill, even when his own soldiers had shown no similar restraint in return. Most strikingly, he described a moment during his own engagement when one of his captured soldiers had been returned unharmed after several hours, carrying a message almost identical in tone and content to the warning Nora Ellison had delivered to us on Varen Hollow. "We are not fighting people who lack the ability to end this quickly and violently," Fenn said quietly, staring into his drink. "We are fighting people who have simply chosen not to, and that choice terrifies me more than anything a straightforward, aggressive enemy could ever do." That conversation marked the beginning of a much longer period of investigation for me, one that would eventually reveal just how widespread this pattern truly was across known space. I spent the following several cycles gathering accounts from other mercenaries who had encountered human special forces during various contracts, some willing to share their experiences openly, others reluctant to discuss engagements that had clearly left lasting psychological scars on soldiers who had otherwise built entire careers around remaining unshaken by violence. A Yellow Talon commander named Resic Thal described an encounter on a distant human agricultural colony where his entire scouting division, renowned across a dozen systems for their tracking abilities, had been completely unable to locate a small human defense unit for nearly 3 full days, despite operating with technology specifically designed to track targets across even the most difficult terrain imaginable. "They did not hide from us the way frightened prey hides from a predator," Resic told me during our conversation. "They hid from us the way a predator hides from prey it has already decided is not worth the effort of confronting directly." A former draft heavy weapons specialist named Corin Vass described a contract involving an attempted raid on a human research facility, where his company's overwhelming firepower had proven almost entirely useless against defenders who seemed to understand exactly how to exploit every weakness in heavy assault tactics without ever exposing themselves to direct confrontation. "We brought enough firepower to level a small city," he said, still visibly unsettled by the memory even cycles after the fact. "And they defeated us using nothing but patience, precision, and a complete refusal to fight the battle on our terms rather than theirs." Perhaps the most striking account I gathered came from a mercenary captain named Elias Whitmore, ironically enough, a human mercenary himself, working for a mixed-species company that had taken a contract against what their employer described as a rogue human paramilitary group operating outside official channels. Elias described an engagement that had ended his own faith in his company's leadership entirely, watching soldiers from a dozen different species systematically dismantled by a small group of human defenders, who fought with a discipline he recognized immediately from his own limited experience within human military culture. "I grew up hearing stories about my grandfather's service," he told me during our conversation, years after Varen Hollow had already faded into distant memory for most people involved. He always said the same thing about why human military doctrine developed the way it did. He said humanity learned, centuries ago, that wars are won not through overwhelming force or aggressive confrontation, but through patience, discipline, and a complete willingness to accept that violence should always be the very last resort rather than the first response. I asked Elias why, if this was true, humanity had developed such an intimidating reputation for military effectiveness rather than simply being known for peaceful negotiation instead. "Because peaceful negotiation only works when both sides are willing to negotiate honestly," he answered. "When that fails, and it does fail, more often than any of us would like to admit, humanity does not respond with panic or desperation. We respond with the same patience and discipline we would have preferred to use in negotiation, just applied through different means. That is what makes us so difficult to fight. We do not lose our composure simply because violence has become necessary." That single conversation, more than any other, helped me finally understand the deeper truth behind everything my squad and I had witnessed on Varen Hollow all those cycles earlier. We had assumed, based on humanity's youth as a spacefaring species and their relatively recent arrival onto the wider galactic stage, that their military capabilities would be similarly undeveloped and inexperienced. What we failed to understand, and what countless other mercenary companies across known space would eventually learn through their own costly encounters, was that humanity's approach to warfare had been shaped by an entirely different set of assumptions than the ones most other species carried into combat. Where many species, including my own, viewed warfare as a natural extension of cultural pride and personal honor, humanity appeared to view it as a last resort, undertaken with the same careful, disciplined patience they applied to any other serious challenge they faced. Where many species expected combat to follow certain predictable patterns of aggression, retreat, and negotiated resolution, humanity approached each engagement as a unique problem requiring careful study and precise solution, unbound by the traditional expectations most other cultures brought into warfare. This difference, subtle as it may have seemed at first glance, created an almost insurmountable advantage whenever human forces found themselves facing opponents who expected war to follow familiar, predictable rules. Word of these repeated encounters eventually spread widely enough throughout mercenary networks across known space that a quiet, unofficial understanding began forming among serious contractors everywhere. It started slowly, individual companies simply becoming more cautious before accepting any contract involving human targets, until eventually this caution solidified into something resembling an actual industry standard. I remember, during one of my final years of active involvement in mercenary circles, encountering an updated standard operating procedure being circulated among several major contracting companies. A simple document that would have seemed absurd to me during my earlier years, yet which now represented hard-earned wisdom paid for through countless failed engagements across dozens of different worlds. The document contained a single, clear instruction that had become almost universally recognized throughout the industry by that point. Confirm target species and any possible human military affiliation before accepting any contract involving armed resistance. If human special forces involvement is suspected or confirmed, immediately renegotiate contract terms to reflect appropriately increased compensation, or decline the contract entirely. I remember reading that instruction and thinking back to the confident laughter that had filled our briefing room all those cycles earlier, before we ever set foot on Varen Hollow. I thought about Breck's easy confidence, about Croce's dismissive arrogance during our second engagement, about Commander Van's stubborn refusal to accept the reality unfolding in front of him, even as his overwhelming force crumbled against an enemy that never once fought according to expectation. None of us had understood, during those early days, exactly what we were truly facing. We assumed youth meant inexperience. We assumed unfamiliarity meant weakness. We assumed that because humanity had only recently arrived upon the wider galactic stage, they had not yet developed the deep, hard-earned wisdom that only comes through countless generations of difficult conflict. What we failed to understand was that humanity's relative youth as a spacefaring civilization meant nothing when measured against their much longer history of conflict on their own world, centuries upon centuries of difficult lessons learned through violence long before they ever developed the technology necessary to reach the stars at all. By the time humanity finally arrived among the wider galactic community, they carried with them an already deeply refined understanding of warfare, tempered through countless generations of hard experience most other species simply never had reason to develop in quite the same way. This, more than any technological advantage or physical capability, became the true reason why serious mercenary companies across known space eventually learned to treat any contract involving human special forces with such extreme caution. It was never about weapons or equipment, though human technology certainly proved more capable than early assumptions suggested. It was never about raw physical strength or endurance, areas where humanity genuinely remained less impressive compared to many other species we regularly encountered throughout our careers. It was, ultimately, about discipline, patience, and a complete willingness to treat violence as a serious, carefully considered choice, rather than an opportunity for demonstration or pride. Every experienced mercenary who eventually encountered human special forces during their career learned the same difficult lesson we had learned on Varen Hollow all those cycles earlier. You could bring overwhelming numbers. You could bring superior technology. You could bring soldiers hardened by decades of experience across 100 different battlefields throughout known space. None of it mattered against an opponent who refused to fight according to any of the assumptions you carried into the engagement, who treated every confrontation as a careful, patient problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won through aggression or overwhelming force, and who somehow maintained genuine moral clarity even while engaged in violence that circumstances had forced upon them against their preference. I think, even now, cycles after my retirement from active mercenary work, about that single quiet transmission Nora Ellison sent during our final failed engagement on Varen Hollow. Any further orbital action will be met with a response your commanders have not yet considered. I never did learn exactly what that response would have been, and I have come to believe, after everything I eventually learned about humanity's approach to conflict, that this uncertainty itself was precisely the point. Humanity, throughout every encounter I ever learned about during my long career, consistently demonstrated a willingness to remain patient and disciplined even when facing overwhelming aggression directed against them. But they also consistently demonstrated a clear, unmistakable warning embedded within that same patience and discipline, one that every serious mercenary company across known space eventually learned to respect completely. Do not assume our patience means we lack the capability or willingness to respond decisively should that restraint finally reach its limit. That lesson, learned at tremendous cost by countless mercenary companies across dozens of different worlds throughout known space, eventually became the foundation for an unspoken but universally respected rule among serious military contractors everywhere. Confirm human involvement before accepting any contract involving armed conflict. If human special forces are involved, renegotiate immediately or simply decline the contract entirely and walk away while you still can. I retired from active mercenary work not long after gathering these final accounts, choosing instead to spend my remaining cycles documenting everything I had learned throughout my long and often difficult career, in hopes that future generations of soldiers across every species might learn from our costly mistakes rather than repeating them through their own painful experience. I think often about young Vex, who survived his injuries on Varen Hollow and went on to build a long, successful career of his own, carrying forward the hard-earned lessons we all learned together on that small, forgotten mining world. I think about Breck, who remained my closest friend and colleague until his own eventual retirement. Cycles after our shared experience had permanently changed how both of us approached every subsequent contract throughout the remainder of our careers. Most of all, I think about the quiet, unassuming discipline shown by every human fighter we ever encountered throughout my long career, soldiers who never once sought glory or recognition for their considerable skill, who approached even necessary violence with genuine reluctance and careful restraint, and who somehow managed to earn the respect and caution of an entire galaxy's worth of experienced, battle-hardened mercenaries, not through overwhelming aggression or intimidating displays of force, but through quiet, patient discipline that proved far more effective than anything the rest of us had ever encountered before. That, I have come to understand after everything I witnessed and learned throughout my long career, is the true and complete answer to the question that eventually spread throughout every serious mercenary company across known space. Why do experienced mercenaries, hardened by countless conflicts across 100 different worlds, ultimately learn to avoid engaging human special forces whenever possible? It is not because humanity possesses some overwhelming technological advantage the rest of us lack. It is not because their soldiers are physically superior to the countless other species we have faced throughout our long, difficult careers. It is because humanity approaches warfare with a patient, disciplined clarity that most of us, despite generations of our own considerable experience, never quite manage to develop ourselves. They do not fight to prove anything. They do not fight for pride or glory or the simple satisfaction of overwhelming a weaker opponent. They fight only when every other option has genuinely been exhausted, and when that moment finally arrives, they fight with a complete, unwavering discipline that makes every advantage the rest of us typically rely upon almost entirely meaningless. That is the lesson Varen Hollow taught me, cycles ago, on a small, forgotten mining world most star charts still refuse to name. And it is a lesson I have never once forgotten since.